Good? Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming to my thesis presentation. I researched conscientization and strengthening resiliency. I looked at art produced as a result of detention centers at the U.S.-Mexico border to see how they contribute to peace building and conflict transformation. So a brief introduction. I'm Olivia. I'm a senior here at Juniata College. I'm part of the PAC department. I individualized my POE to intercultural conflict intervention with a secondary in Spanish. So I brought together those two studies by looking at the U.S.-Mexico border and looking at art. That's part of the peace building arts field of peace and conflict studies. So I started my research with a really just basic question of how does art and the activists behind it contribute to peace building? It's one of the fields, one of the newer fields of peace building, peace and conflict studies, and something that I learned about last semester. So we wanted to dive more into it and learn more about it. And with the ongoing conflict, the U.S.-Mexico border, this seemed like a really good time to do so. So I'm going to start the presentation with a literature review. I looked at what we already know in the field in regards to important scholars and terminology, what peace building the arts is as a field, human rights doctrine, and how I developed my analytical framework that I use to analyze the art. So the first two scholars I'm going to work with are Adam Curl and Paulo Freire. These two scholars worked with how do we transform conflict, how do we take unbalanced relationships, and how do we take latent conflict, which means conflict that's not armed, it's not out in the streets, but it's a little more behind the scenes, and how do we transform it, how do we rebuild those relationships. So Adam Curl says that education is the first step to move unbalanced relationships to ones that are balanced. And he has a model, well, look over to you real quick, that ends up looking like this. So once you start in this bottom left-hand corner with low awareness, meaning that people aren't aware that they're in a conflict or that there is a conflict, and it's really unbalanced relationships, and moves up to the top right, with peaceful relationships that are balanced. Look back for a quick second. And so he sees education as that first step. And his model is a little bit more drawn out. There are these 4 steps that go into it. And it's an awareness of the situation, its causes, and potential solutions. Those steps to actually achieve those solutions are in later steps of his model. Whereas Paulo Freire, he's a Portuguese and Brazilian scholar, he saw education as having the express intent of spurring action. It wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't just learning about what's the situation, what are hypothetical causes, but using education to actually enact change with it. And so part of that might be looking at one's own identity and look at your own role in society to understand what ideas, what beliefs do you have that might be contributing to your oppression. And with that idea, he wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that looks at how do oppressors give their ideals to people that they oppress and use that to justify their oppression. So what ideas do we have as being very self-reflective about what have I learned that's actually not my best interest. So I really boil these down to 2 really basic sentences to keep with us. Adam Curl looks at recognizing oppression within a system, whereas Paulo Freire looks at recognizing oppression within oneself. Paulo Freire created the word conscientization, which is what we saw in my title. And conscientization is that awareness in order to spur action. It's a deeper awareness. It's self-reflective, and it wants to create change. It's reactive, as opposed to just being theoretical. It comes from a Portuguese word, and the English translation was provided by his translator, Mayra Bergen Ramos. So that's the word we're going to use for the duration. It means an awareness, it means education, an awareness in order to do something with that information. So whereas Curl and Freire were concerned with active, ongoing conflict and the importance of education as a catalyst for change, Johan Galtung was concerned with violence at every other time of the year. Violence when there's no armed soldiers in the street. Violence when there's not dozens of deaths from protests. So Galtung's framework has become known as the conflict triangle model. That's what's pictured there on the right. It positions structural, cultural, and direct violence as opposing corners of the triangle. And each type of violence supports and reinforces each other. Direct violence is clear and it's tangible. It's a singular event that we can look at and we can list. Cultural and structural violence are a little more tricky. They're invisible. They're behind the scenes, if you will. They are the legal and social justifications that make those direct violence events possible. Cultural violence refers to the attitudes that justify war, imprisonment, and the death penalty, whereas structural violence are the processes leading to those events becoming possible, like changes in laws. Galton's model is also used to create a theoretical framework to understand the process of dehumanization. Dehumanization becomes culturally acceptable for many through encouraging rhetoric that suggests, quote, the majority group is taught to regard the other group as less than culturally accepted, as less than human, and even alien to their society. They are indoctrinated to believe we are better off without them. And that's from Genocide Watch. These lessons are aimed at majority groups to create a feeling that we can get rid of those other people. It creates a feeling of superiority, and it's encouraged through documentation, public forms of education, schools, government-funded radios, television programs, and the press. We end up seeing dehumanization carried on through a lot of different types of research in peace and conflict studies. One of the downsides is the field doesn't really look at rehumanization as much. It's not a word that's recognized. And it's something that we have to build on in the future in the field. Rehumanization, putting the humanity first in people, taking away that language that dehumanizes them and makes them as less than us, less than the majority group. So, some terminology to kind of get us to where we are so far. I'm going to use the word child in the upcoming presentation. It's referring to anyone under the age of 18. I may also describe them as being youths or being underage, and that's just what that word means. Conscientization, it's that learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action. And again, Myra Ramos is the translator who actually provided that English version of the word. Dehumanization is making the other less than us. Direct violence, a single, tangible event. Cultural violence, social attitudes and beliefs that justify those events. And structural violence, the processes that create and justify the opportunity for violent events. And then I took a look at what is the field of peace building in the arts. It's relatively new, but it's grown very rapidly, and a lot of literature and articles have been written about it since. It uses art to look at ongoing conflicts. It becomes a really powerful tool because art can address things that normal structures cannot. It can address pop culture, it can address ideas, beliefs, religion, in ways that formal laws just can't help people with. It helps with that emotional and that social aspect of conflict. It's really versatile. Art it's not just murals and paintings, it's spoken words, it's hip hop, it's presentations, it's performances, it's any artistic endeavor, which will vary a lot from culture to culture. And so what can art do? Shank and Scourge are two researchers that wrote an entire article about what are the possibilities for it. And in that, they really identified these 4 pieces. They can address ongoing conflicts, it can memorialize past traumas, encourage peace, and foster violence. Those first 2 we're going to go into a little more depth, but those are really relevant to this thesis. But the last 2 I'll sum up here. Encouraging peace has to do with that cultural and artistic endeavors can advocate for values of diversity, secularism, inclusion, tolerance, gender equality, human rights, and peace through the themes that they chose. And fostering violence refers to controversial artwork, such as propaganda. So, the Special Rapporteur's Report is a UN document that was created based off the research by Shank and Scourge. That research really identified these are the 4 things art can do, and she took that document and really delved into it in more detail. And she identified within these 2 categories, these 2 or 3 things that I think are really fundamental. Versatility. She notes that art's application to society and conflict is beneficial because artistic endeavors can be led by individual artists, ensembles, small and large cultural institutions, therefore making the projects versatile, and their form and size can be adapted to local context. The dynamic nature of art means it can be developed alongside updates in conflict and can be produced much more rapidly than academic articles or changes in academic curriculum. It's ubiquitous. Art is in all cultures and traditions worldwide and takes so many different forms. And it's reactive. Rather than addressing a past conflict, it's reflecting on it. With ongoing conflicts, you want to be preventative. You want to try to stop escalation before it gets too far. And with memorializing past traumas, there's a bilateral acknowledgement. It's that both groups have to acknowledge that we've all lost something, even if that means the people that have hurt you. You have to acknowledge their losses too, that they have lost their homes or their sons or their families. And that bilateral acknowledgement of mourning losses can help build peace and make more durable relationships. And it can help resist oppression. She uses the words facilitators and correspondents to describe the roles people can take in the conflict. Facilitators are activists that work on behalf of people in conflict. They're third parties. Whereas correspondents are people within the conflict itself. They're people telling their own stories, giving their own narratives. And a brief review of human rights doctrine. When we talk about conflict, a lot of what we're talking about is human rights violations. But human rights violations are in tandem with what are human rights. And art and culture are considered human rights by the UN. So despite this ubiquitous use of human rights and their importance, we don't have a clear single definition of what they are. But this hasn't stopped human rights being included in constitutions, laws, and foundational documents. The identification and acknowledgement of human rights, perhaps ideally, is to prevent future violations and confront previous abuses. Human rights violations are both a form of violence and can act as an impetus for continued violence. Thus, the ability to address and resolve such violations are of the utmost relevance to the field of peacebuilding and conflict studies. The United Nations has been considered the preeminent authority of the creation of human rights doctrine. 3 declarations of particular importance in my thesis were the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is of particular importance because I focus solely on the youth detention centers along the U.S.-Mexico border. Additionally, this convention explicitly prohibits family separation, child abuse, and mandates that the state protect the well-being of children first and foremost. All 3 of these documents listed have been signed and ratified by the United States as part of the United Nations. And finally, I also reviewed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because it's not unreasonable to assume that some of the children detained may be of Indigenous background. So there's a little bit of a linguistic hiccup I want to address real quick. For the duration of this presentation, I'm going to use the word estadounidense to describe the American people. This is because of this linguistic hiccup that I'm referring to. There is a word for American in Spanish, it's Americano, but it doesn't quite translate the same. Americano can refer to anyone living in the American continent, north, south, or central. It's not used the same way that we use it to refer only to the United States. They have a separate word, it's estadounidense. There's no translation for this word. It translates something to United Staters, or we don't have a translation for it. We haven't considered having another word for it. So if I refer to people that are American, live in the United States, residents of the United States, citizens of the United States, I'm going to use the word estadounidense from here on out, just for clarity. So I developed this analytical framework. How do I decide if the art fits within the realm of peace building and conflict transformation? I wanted to fit one of these 4 categories. These were what were most important to the United Nations Special Rapporteur in her outline, and this is why I saw it being most relevant to the field of peace building in the arts. So does the art contribute to peace building via either conscientization, which is increasing conversation, increasing that awareness, or how does the experience reflect los valores estadounidenses, which translates to American values? Again, using that word to avoid that linguistic hiccup with the word American. And or, how does it strengthen resilience by helping the people involved to mourn their losses or resist oppression by acting as a facilitator or a correspondent? It doesn't have to meet all of these. It can meet one, it can meet all 4 of them, it can meet some combination of these 2 columns. And my thesis did not evaluate the efficiency of detention centers, but rather will examine the examples of direct and structural violence that contribute to human rights violations. The situation goes beyond politics. It's a humanitarian issue with reported and detailed examples of direct violence against detained youth. So finally, our content analysis. We'll get to the art soon, I promise. So for a little bit of context of what the situation is. There's some historical context we should be aware of and some political context. Historical context is relatively short. Latin America is known for being a relatively unstable region of the world, politically and economically. Since 1950, there's been 14 civil wars and 9, possibly 10 dictators, depends on who you ask, the 10th being Evo Morales from Bolivia. There's increased presence in power of gangs and cartels due to political and economic instability. Cartels and gangs can provide people living there with money, protection, resources, and a job in places where there otherwise aren't any. There's a lack of resources and infrastructure to deal with large-scale migration in Central America. Countries like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Mexico don't have the money and resources to deal with large influxes of migration the way the United States does. Thus, they tend to bypass those countries and arrive in the United States instead. But that's also part because there's no safe third country agreement signed with any Latin American country. A safe third country agreement means that we have signed a treaty with another country that says your country is safe enough that for people seeking asylum, they can petition asylum in your country. We do not have such a document with any Latin American country. They cannot stop in Mexico to ask for asylum there. They must arrive at our border until we assign such a document with any Latin American country. And there's some political context. Policy changes. In April 2018, the Trump administration started the zero-tolerance policy. And then with that, they created detention centers for cases to be reviewed. However, not all cases under review are in these detention centers. Overflow of cases are currently in essentially migrant cities along the US-Mexico border on the Mexican side, and create these little, essentially shanty towns for people awaiting their case that cannot be in detention centers. In these detention centers, there are some for single adults, for families, and then unaccompanied minors. These unaccompanied minors can either be children that arrived on their own, or they also end up becoming children that were separated from their families. In early 2019, the Trump administration was ordered by Dana Sabra, a federal judge, to reunite children that had been separated from their parents at the border on or after July 1st, 2017. However, critics have noticed the administration's inability to find parents, locate children, and a general sense of reluctance to follow through with the court order. The most recent policy change occurred in 2019 when the Trump administration moved to end the limit of how long children could be detained. This limit refers to the 1997 Flores Agreement, signed by INS Commissioner Doris Meisner, that stated children must be released as soon as possible to parents, guardians, or other adult relatives. Since the original 1977 agreement, recent judges have expanded that agreement to include unaccompanied minors and even established a 20-day limit before the government is obligated to release the minor. So I want to move a little bit further. I want to describe to you what the detention centers are like and what the accusations are coming out about what children are facing there. There are currently 31 detention centers along the US-Mexico border. Well, there's 31 in Texas, 2 in New Mexico, 6 in Arizona, and 10 in California. Some of the centers have since been shut down due to these allegations. I'd like to read an excerpt about this. Quote, "A wide range of allegations of mistreatment by migrant adolescents and teens, including inedible food, brutally cold temperatures with no blankets for all children, not being informed of their rights, bullying, guards who kick their feet to wake them up, and verbal abuse. These allegations are a small sample of the examples of direct violence against the detained youth. These conditions appear to be the result of legislative changes taken by the Trump administration to reduce funding for open facilities, in addition to the original lack of necessary facilities. A newspaper article from 2019 described Border Patrol Station in Clint, Texas, that had, quote, a stated capacity of 105 children. On June 1st, there were 676. As of May 2019, 6 children have died while in ICE custody due to the overcrowding and unsanitary condition of the detention centers. From Dr. Zaragoza, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, she described, children who are detained show signs of physical and emotional stress. These can include developmental delays, poor psychological adjustment, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and other behavioral problems. The Department of Homeland Security is also currently investigating allegations of sexual assault against migrant teen girls in the Tornillo facility in Texas. The other political context to be aware of is the political rhetoric used by representatives of the United States government to justify the detention. And some themes appear that are most salient when we read these quotes. The first really focuses on laws. He paints the United States as a country that our laws and our justice is important to us, and he thinks that they are insufficient. The second, an example of dehumanization, describing them as animals rather than people. The third, this isn't a fight, this is a battle, this is a war. It seemed very, very militaristic to me. The United States, one of our prides is that we have one of the biggest and most powerful militaries in the world, which is great if there's a war, but is not so great when we're detaining children along the border. And the last, she cites her family history that's extensive, and that she even comes from an immigrant family. Coming from an immigrant family is something that's important to the United States. We're a nation of immigrants, and that we're multicultural. And so all of these people that are supporting the detention of youth are drawing on these American values to support why these facilities are necessary. But this brings me to the American values, los valores estadounidenses. What are the values that both groups people representing the United States government and activists are drawing on to justify their position. For those in favor of detention centers, there's an obligation to protect its security as assets. The United States as a police station, as a protector of rights and protector of the world. That we have to set an example for others. We're militaristic, that we really value our military and our strength. That we value merit, hard work, and honor. Trump quotes in his first quote on the other page that his problem doesn't appear to be with immigration, is that it's illegal immigration. That if they were following the laws, perhaps we wouldn't have a problem with it. And that for us, and for those supporting the detention centers, justice is by following the law. When I started the research, I anticipated that the activist response would be to draw on the values that were the opposite of those listed and those seen by supporting detention centers. So I anticipated they would draw on the importance of a nation of immigrants, even though we're turning them away. That the U.S. has to be an example, and that maybe we're setting the wrong example. That justice is about equality, and that we're the land of opportunity, and these are people looking for an opportunity. So for my first analysis, I looked at the Centennial Museum in El Paso, Texas. The Centennial Museum created an exhibit called Uncaged Art. It was on display from April through October 2019. This collection, quote, presents the work of youth ages 13 to 17 who were detained at the Tornillo Detention Center in West Texas. Tornillo was considered the largest detention center for children in the United States, with 2,500 youth when it closed in January 2019, although more than 6,000 children passed through the center since it opened in June 2018. The exhibit was open and free to the public to encourage local members to learn about the thoughts, hopes, dreams, and fears of the children detained near their hometown. This exhibit fits within the scope of my thesis because the exhibit encouraged conscientization by raising awareness of the detained youth experience in the public sphere, and the art itself provided an opportunity for the children to reflect on their own experiences, thus making them correspondents under our analytical framework. The museum's effort to make these humanitarian concerns part of the public sphere was twofold. First, by pulling the art from the detention center into a public exhibit, and second, by further pushing those images into the neighborhood outside the museum, as pictured here. The stated purpose of the exhibit was to provide the public with, quote, a window into the personal world of migrant children whose visions and voices have often been left out of mainstream media accounts, end quote. One news article by NBC describes how, quote, some of the pieces of uncaged art are displayed behind chain link fencing and barbed wire to remind visitors of the conditions inside Tornillo. As participants walk through the exhibit, they take on the perspective of a guard walking through the Tornillo facility, looking at the children through these caged wires. Some of the pieces include symbolism from Latin American folklore, such as the quetzal, pictured here, which is both the national bird of Guatemala and a symbol of freedom. And the scarlet macaw, pictured on the other side, the national bird of Honduras. One work features the quetzal holding a document labeled Libertad 15 de Septiembre, freedom the 15th of September, thus making reference to both the national symbol of freedom, the bird, but also the day the country achieved independence from Spain. I see this inclusion of such explicit references to freedom and liberty as subtle methods of rebellion. The young artists are acting as correspondents in their ability to express their own feelings, which would be considered a form of resisting oppression to strengthen resilience. Next, I'm going to show you 3 images, and I will not describe them. I'll describe them at the end. I put all 3 together. A common piece of symbolism in these artworks that I looked at were churches and religious figures. Traditionally, churches have been symbolic of peace and acted as a sanctuary. Figures like the Virgin Mary have been used to represent love, forgiveness, and patience. As of a 2014 Pew Research survey, 69% of Latin Americans identified as Catholic at the time of the survey, and 19% identified as Protestant. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, at least 3 of the pieces were religious in nature, with 2 depicting traditional churches, these 2 on the left, and another depicting a drawing of the Virgen de Guadalupe from Mexico, pictured there on the right. She's this one. The Virgen de Guadalupe is another name for the Virgin Mary in Catholic tradition that is used primarily in Mexico due to a folk tale about the apparition of the Virgin to a common laborer named Juan Diego. The image of the Virgen de Guadalupe appears to also be included in a 3-dimensional model of a church right here. She's right here on the left. as one of the only colorful elements outside of an otherwise mostly white structure. Additionally, it's worth considering the association between churches and their social function. Although churches also host weddings and baptisms, they are also places of funerals, wakes, and places of mourning. As spectators, we could not understand what the detained youth have experienced or if they have lost friends or family in the process. The inclusion of religious symbols in their artwork may be a reference to mourning their losses by leaving their homes and their families. I'd also like to point out, this top piece of art was made using the restroom sign for unaccompanied female children. She built it on using materials she found in the prison. It should be noted that up until this point, the children who create these art pieces have referred to as children, minors, or artists. It's not to deny them credit for their work, but it's rather out of necessity. Children were not allowed to sign the pieces with their real names, and those who rebelled had their names blacked out. Instead, they chose military-style code names that appear in the corner of many pieces, such as the model soccer match made by Bravo 20, or other children who were asked to cross out their names on the back of their work. They identified themselves as Alpha 9, Charlie 1, and Foxtrot 6. This, quote, institutionally imposed anonymity, end quote, was meant to protect the children, given they are still legally minors, but also consequently, quote, reduce them in their art to letters and numbers expressed in military lingo, end quote. This decision to omit their names is another example of structural violence that contributes to the dehumanization of detained youth. The 9 photos from the Uncaged Art exhibit fit within the scope of this thesis in their ability to function as methods of communication for the children detained in Tornillo. The use of symbolism as a means of rebellion for freedom, churches that represent sanctuaries and may reflect mourning, and the decision of the Centennial Museum to make the exhibit open and free to the public to increase awareness in the public sphere fits within the research criteria of conscientization through raising awareness and strengthening resilience. I next went to Manhattan, New York. This project was part of a campaign called #NoKidsInCages, ran by the nonprofit immigration organization Raices. When later interviewed about the project, Jonathan Ryan, the CEO at Raices, made a direct reference to conscientization, who explained that the goal was to, quote, bring this back to the consciousness of the American people, end quote. Mr. Ryan further commented that one of his explicit goals was the belief that it's important for people to be confronted with the reality that this is about children, human beings, whose lives are forever affected. Mr. Ryan suggests that by doing nothing, an individual is affirming the actions of the Trump administration and thus adding this moment to part of our national identity. He pushed back by creating and organizing these art installations because he believes such actions do not accurately reflect the American national identity. He commented that, quote, if we don't do something to stop this, this will become who we are, end quote. And that Raices' Twitter account further posted that day, quote, we cannot be a nation that separates families. These pop-up installations in New York were successful, but they were only up for a few hours. They were up from about 5 a.m. to noon before police took them down. These were some of the quotes from newscasters and from pedestrians that were interviewed by the news about how they felt and how they reacted. I tried to find a transcript of the audio to include it in my thesis, and I could not because no such transcript exists. Not a single news station recorded the audio because they found it too disturbing for the news. As Katie Corrado says in her quote, that it's a bit haunting and frankly disturbing, and she intentionally stood far enough away so that you could not hear it on the TV. 2 pedestrians also were able to make comments, although one of them was unnamed. The first stating that we are not animals. We are not meant for cages like this. Even though they're not from here, they're still kids. I don't know if that's a direct reference to Trump's quote that they are animals, but it appears like so to me. And Karen Flaherty, another pedestrian from New York, we need to remind people about the suffering that's happening within the world, within our own United States of America, raising consciousness and making people more aware, fitting within conscientization. These installations were successful because they brought a natural level issue down to personal level engagement with dialogue that provided opportunity for critical thinking for the pedestrians of New York, who may not have otherwise considered how the detainment of children in Texas and Florida reflect their personal identities as estadounidenses. Lastly, I looked at Tucson and McAllen, Texas. Even though these are 2 different cities, I kept them together because they both had the least amount of information available for them. From McAllen, we have access to 3 drawings made by children reflecting their memories of their time in detention. From Tucson, we have a short poem by a previously detained girl named Rosita that also reflects her memories of detention. The pictures of these drawings were published by the American Academy of Pediatrics after being received by Dr. Zaragoza, president of the Academy. The 3 children that produced the drawings were around 8 years old, 2 of them from Guatemala and the 3rd from an unknown country of origin. Dr. Gotha also visited one of the detention facilities to evaluate their medical facilities and capabilities. Following her visit to detention facilities, she expressed her concern regarding the long-term effects of the trauma endured by the youth during their detention. Dr. Gotha commented that the situation is not just as a medical professional, but also as a resident of the United States that opposes the actions taken by the Trump administration on behalf of the United States citizens. And through the works I will show you, we will value what is missing from the picture in addition to what is shown. All 4 of the works from Tucson and McAllen are examples of how art can strengthen resilience by providing the youth an opportunity to tell their own story as correspondents in the conflict. Additionally, I would argue the American Academy of Pediatrics and Dr. Gotha are also peace builders for their role as facilitators by publishing the photos and providing Dr. Gotha's comments denouncing the detainment. Given that these drawings are a visual medium, we sadly have no accompanying notes, descriptions, or quotes from the children to help give context to what their experience was like. The first drawing shows toilets, but no doors to provide privacy for those using the bathroom. Even more, there appears to be no privacy suggested in any of the drawings, no dedicated place for children to change, no walls for a designated sleeping area. Only one child included a depiction of a designated bathroom, but none of the images included any signs of where children ate, played, got exercise, or had access to educational or religious activities. In this picture, children are shown frowning inside a cage-like structure, while guards standing on the outside are smiling. All 3 pictures include this cage-like structure. The policies that created such an environment are examples of structural violence on behalf of the United States government to use its laws and institutions as a means of creating an undignified and perhaps even unsafe place for children to live while in government custody. Critiques from other politicians, like Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, state that if these conditions were found in the home of a United States family, it would be considered child abuse. In President Trump's speech to justify the increased security at the border, he dehumanized the Latin American immigrants by showing them as animals. And in these drawings, he appears to have kept their word by keeping them in cages. This is the same quote that I read to you earlier from Dr. Zaragoza. But she made one more comment at the end of that sentence that reflects her vision of los valores estadounidenses. Believing that the situation is more of a humanitarian concern than a political one, she explained that we need to do better by these people. As Americans, we are capable of doing better. By acknowledging the mass detention of youth along the U.S.-Mexico border, fundamentally as a humanitarian issue, Dr. Gotha is able to encourage rehumanization of children as people with a fundamental right to safety and medical attention, rather than acting as a tool for political debate. Lastly, this thesis would like to include a brief poem by Rosita, the only poem available thus far to describe firsthand what the detention facilities were like. Rosita's poem contributes to conflict transformation because she is now a correspondent, telling a bit about her own experience. This ability to voice her story meets one of the criteria needed to strengthen resilience by resisting oppression, as explained by Special Rapporteur for the United Nations. Despite Rosita's contribution to the conflict transformation effort, little is known about her or her family. The Ward 6 of Tucson newsletter that published her poem did not know anything about the girl specifically and was unable to be tracked down after it left the community room. The work is written in prose and made up of 5 verses in a single stanza. There's no rhyme scheme across the verses, and the stanza is only 1 sentence. But in those 5 verses, Rosita focuses on the sound she recalls from the detention centers, the storm-like rumbling of the aluminum sheets that children used to sleep on the floor. This perspective reminds activists and critics of the detention centers of the central concern regarding children being detained. The vast majority do not and cannot understand why they are detained, thus making the situation even more traumatic. The title of Rosita's poem, translated to "The Sound I Will Remember," not just recalls her past experience, but notes that her detention will be an event that she carries with her for at least the foreseeable future, if not the rest of her life. Her poem serves as a reminder that the examples of direct and structural violence noted thus far in this essay are not singular events that can be changed without consequence. the psychological effects of violence will linger for years, and further research will be needed in the future to determine the extent of the trauma and how it affects their development into adolescence and adulthood. So with all that in mind, what have we learned, and what can we take away from the art produced by these children and by these activists? That we saw some themes that kept reappearing: dehumanization, resiliency, and developing personal and collective agency. And I believe all the exhibits are examples of conscientization or strengthening resilience, and thus contribute to peace building. But the most common qualifying factor for the role of these pieces themselves is that the shown actors correspond in the conflict, and that the actors behind the art draw on different values compared to those used in political rhetoric to justify their position. And so my initial thoughts for los valores estadounidenses were correct. It's a nation of immigrants. The U.S. needs to set an example that justice is equality more than laws, and that this is a land of opportunity.